My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, and on March 15, 1948, I died for 7 minutes and 12 seconds in an American prisoner of war camp. I was 28 years old, 3 years into my imprisonment. I was folding laundry when my heart simply stopped. What happened next changed everything I believed about forgiveness, about God, and about my unforgivable past. I need to tell you about the darkness I carried, the weight that pressed down on my chest every single day for 3 years before my heart finally gave out. To understand what Jesus did for me, you have to know what kind of man I was. You have to know the blood on my hands. I was a soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. From 1943 to 1945, I was stationed in the occupied Philippines, part of the Pacific Theater that would become a graveyard for so many. When I first put on that uniform, I told myself I was serving my emperor, serving my country, feeding my poor family back in Osaka. But somewhere in those jungles, somewhere between the first village we burned and the last civilian I watched die, I knew I had become something evil. The orders came down through the chain of command like they always did. Clean out the villages, eliminate potential resistance, make examples that would keep the population in line. I followed those orders. God forgive me. I followed every single one of them. In Manila, during those final desperate months before our defeat, I participated in executions of civilians. Men, women, elderly people who had done nothing but live in the wrong place at the wrong time. I can still hear the sound of bodies hitting the ground. I can still smell the smoke from the houses we set ablaze. But there was one face that haunted me more than all the others. Her name was Maria Santos, though I only learned that much later. She was a Filipino mother, maybe 30 years old, with 3 small children clinging to her dress when we came to her village. Our commander had decided this place needed to be made an example. I watched this woman drop to her knees in the dirt, begging in broken Japanese mixed with her native tongue. She pointed to her children, the youngest barely old enough to walk. Her eyes locked with mine, and in them I saw something I had forgotten existed. I saw pure, desperate love. She was pleading with me, human to human, mother's heart to whatever humanity remained in mine. But I had my orders. I had my duty. I turned away when the commander gave the signal. I told myself I was just following orders, that this was war, that this was what soldiers did. But her eyes still visited me every night 3 years later in that Texas prison camp. They visited me in dreams, and in the moments between sleep and waking, when the mind cannot lie to itself. When the Americans captured me during the Battle of Luzon in 1945, part of me was relieved. The killing was over. The orders would stop coming. But the memories, the faces, the weight of what I had become, that followed me into captivity like a shadow that could never be cast off. Camp Huntsville, in Texas, became my new world. Barbed wire stretched in every direction. Guard towers watching our every move. The other Japanese prisoners were a mix of broken men, some still clinging to defiance, others who had simply given up. A few had taken their own lives rather than live with what we had done. I understood their choice, though I lacked their courage. Every morning, I woke to the same routine. Roll call at dawn, work detail in the camp laundry or kitchen, meager meals of bread and thin soup, and then the long evening hours when there was nothing to do but remember. The Americans were not cruel to us, not compared to what we had done to others. They gave us basic necessities, medical care when we needed it, even allowed us to receive occasional letters from home. but no amount of decent treatment could wash away the stain on my soul. I shared a barracks with 20 other men, sleeping on thin mattresses that smelled of disinfectant and despair. At night, when the lights went out, I could hear them. Some cried quietly into their pillows. Others muttered prayers to ancestors or gods who seemed very far away. A few talked in their sleep, reliving battles, or calling out names of people they would never see again. But most nights, the barracks filled with a silence so heavy it felt like drowning. The guilt was a living thing inside me. It ate away at everything good I had ever been or hoped to be. I remembered my mother back in Osaka, teaching me as a small boy to be kind to others, to help those in need. I remembered the gentle way she would bandage my scraped knees and tell me stories of honorable samurai who protected the innocent. What would she think of her son now? What would she say if she knew what these hands had done? I had dishonored not just my family, but my own humanity. I had become the monster in someone else's nightmare. During those 3 years in the camp, I contemplated ending my life more times than I can count. I would lie awake planning it, thinking about which method would be quickest, would cause the least disruption to my fellow prisoners. But each time, something held me back. Not hope, because I had no hope left. Not fear, because death seemed like relief. Something else. Something I could not name then, but understand now. Have you ever done something so terrible that you believed you were beyond redemption? Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen a stranger wearing your face, someone you never intended to become? That was my daily reality. I was a man drowning in guilt, suffocating under the weight of unforgivable acts, waiting for death to claim me naturally since I could not claim it myself. I thought I would die in that camp, forgotten and unforgiven. I thought my story would end with my bones buried in foreign soil, my name spoken only as a warning of what war could turn a man into. I had no way of knowing that on March 15th, 1948, my real story was about to begin. The morning of March 15th, 1948 started like every other morning in Camp Huntsville. The wake-up bell clanged at 5:30, echoing off the concrete walls of our barracks. I rolled off my thin mattress, my back aching from 3 years of sleeping on springs that had given up their fight long ago. The Texas air was still cool in the pre-dawn darkness, but I knew it would be blazing hot by noon. Spring in Texas was unpredictable that way, just like everything else about this country that had become my prison. After a roll call and a breakfast of watery oatmeal and black coffee, I was assigned to laundry duty. It was work I had grown to prefer over the kitchen detail or the grounds maintenance. In the laundry, there was something almost meditative about the routine. The hot water, the smell of soap, the repetitive motions of washing and folding. It was honest work, clean work, and for a few hours each day, I could pretend I was just a man doing his job instead of a war criminal waiting for his sentence to end. The camp laundry was housed in a long, low building with concrete floors that stayed damp from the constant steam. Industrial washing machines lined one wall, their metal drums churning and sloshing like mechanical heartbeats. Along the opposite wall stood the folding tables where we processed the endless stream of uniforms, bed linens, and towels that kept the camp running. I was working alongside Kenji Nakamura that morning, a fellow prisoner from Kyoto who had been captured in the same campaign as me. Kenji was younger, maybe 25, with a quiet manner that reminded me of the monks I had seen in temples back home. We rarely spoke during work, but there was comfort in having another Japanese man nearby, someone who understood the weight we both carried without needing to put it into words. That morning, though, Kenji was more talkative than usual. There had been rumors circulating through the camp for weeks that some of the prisoners might be released soon. The war had been over for almost 3 years, and there was talk in Washington about what to do with men like us. Some said we would be sent back to Japan. Others believed we would be transferred to work camps where we could earn our freedom through labor. Kenji was hopeful in the way that only young men can be hopeful, still believing that the future might hold something better than the past. "Hiroshi-san," he said quietly as we folded a stack of American military uniforms. The irony was not lost on either of us, handling the clothes of the army that had defeated us. "Do you think they will really let us go home?" I shrugged, focusing on creasing the sleeves of a sergeant's shirt. "Home to what, Kenji? What is waiting for us there?" He was quiet for a moment, his hands working automatically. "My parents, if they are still alive. My sister's children, who I have never met. A chance to be something other than this." I understood his longing, but I could not share it. Japan held nothing for me now, but more ghosts, more reminders of who I had been before the war turned me into something else. At least here, in this camp surrounded by desert and endless sky, I was just another prisoner. Here, the people I had wronged were an ocean away, and their faces only haunted my dreams. It was around 6:30 when the pain started. We were working on a particularly large load of laundry, uniforms from a visiting inspection team, and I was reaching across the table to grab another stack when I felt it. A tightness in my chest, like someone was slowly closing a fist around my heart. I straightened up, thinking I had just pulled a muscle, but the sensation intensified. The pain spread across my chest like fire, radiating down my left arm in waves that made me gasp. I tried to keep working, thinking it would pass, but within moments I could barely breathe. The folding table in front of me began to blur, and I felt sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the cool morning air. "Kenji," I managed to say, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The pain hit me like a sledgehammer then, crushing and absolute. I dropped the uniform I was holding and clutched at my chest, feeling my knees buckle. The concrete floor rushed up to meet me, cold and unforgiving against my face. I could hear Kenji's voice, as if from a great distance, calling my name, then shouting in English. "Help! Help! Hiroshi is sick. Someone help!" Through the fog of pain, I was aware of boots running across the concrete floor. Voices shouting in English. Words I could not quite understand through the roaring in my ears. Someone rolled me over, and I found myself staring up at the fluorescent lights that lined the ceiling of the laundry building. They seemed impossibly bright, like looking directly into the sun. Sergeant Morrison was the first guard to reach me. He was a decent man, as guards went, someone who had never treated us with cruelty. I could see his face hovering above mine, his mouth moving, but the words sounded like they were coming through water. Behind him, other prisoners had gathered, their faces etched with concern and fear. In a place like this, death was always lurking, and we all knew how quickly it could claim a man. The camp medic arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. Lieutenant Hayes was a competent doctor who had served in the Pacific Theater before being assigned to the camp. He had treated many of us over the years, always professional, always thorough. I felt his hands on my chest, checking for breath, for heartbeat, for any sign that life was still fighting inside my failing body. "I can't find a pulse," I heard him say, and those were the last words my ears would hear in this world. The dying process was unlike anything I could have imagined. There was no dramatic moment, no final breath that marked the end. Instead, it was like slowly sinking beneath the surface of a dark lake. The voices around me faded first, then the sensation of the cold floor against my back, then the bright lights overhead. One by one, my senses simply stopped reporting to a mind that was preparing to leave its earthly home. I felt myself floating, rising up from the scene below, like smoke from an extinguished candle. Looking down, I could see my own body lying motionless on the laundry room floor. Lieutenant Hayes was performing chest compressions, pushing hard against ribs that would no longer respond. Sergeant Morrison was directing the other prisoners back, giving the medic room to work. Kenji stood frozen in place, his face pale with shock, still holding the uniform he had been folding when I collapsed. The strangest thing was how peaceful I felt watching all this unfold. The crushing pain in my chest was completely gone. The guilt and shame that had weighed on me for years seemed distant, like memories from someone else's life. I felt lighter than I had since childhood, free from the burden of flesh and bone and all the terrible things they had done. Lieutenant Hayes worked on my body for several more minutes, trying everything he knew to bring me back. But I could see what he could not yet accept. The man named Hiroshi Tanaka, prisoner number 4047, former soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, was dead. His heart had simply stopped, worn out by 3 years of guilt and grief and the impossible weight of unforgiven sins. Finally, the medic sat back on his heels and checked his watch. "Time of death, 6:47 a.m., he announced to the room. His voice carried the weary resignation of a man who had pronounced too many deaths in his career. Someone brought a sheet and pulled it over my face, hiding the peaceful expression that death had given me. The other prisoners began to disperse, returning to their work with the quiet efficiency that defined life in the camp. Kenji remained for a long moment, staring down at the covered form that had been his friend and fellow prisoner. I watched all of this with detached interest, the way you might watch a play about someone else's life. I was dead. Officially, medically, completely dead. My story, I thought, was finally over. But as I lingered there above the scene of my death, I began to sense that something else was beginning. The laundry room, the camp, the world itself was starting to fade around the edges, and I was being drawn toward something I could not yet see. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about endings, and about what comes after. As I floated above my lifeless body in that Texas prison camp laundry room, something began to pull me away from the scene of my death. It was not a physical sensation, because I no longer had a physical body to feel with. Instead, it was like being drawn by the most powerful magnet imaginable. But this magnet pulled at something deeper than flesh and bone. It pulled at the very essence of who I was. The laundry room began to fade around me, growing dim and distant like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The voices of Lieutenant Hayes and Sergeant Morrison became whispers, then silence. The concrete walls and fluorescent lights dissolved into shadow, and I found myself moving through what I can only describe as a tunnel, though that word fails to capture the reality of what I experienced. The tunnel was not dark, as you might expect. Instead, it pulsed with a soft, warm light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I was traveling at incredible speed, faster than any airplane or train I had ever imagined. Yet I felt no wind, no sense of rushing air. The movement was smooth and purposeful, as if I was being carried by invisible hands toward a destination that had been prepared for me long before I knew I needed to reach it. As I traveled through this space between worlds, I became aware that I was not alone. There were other presences moving alongside me, though I could not see them clearly. They felt ancient and peaceful, like gentle guides who had made this journey countless times before. Their presence filled me with a sense of safety I had not known since childhood. Before the war had taught me that the world was full of terrible things, and that I was capable of being one of them. The light ahead of me grew brighter and more intense. But unlike earthly light, it did not hurt to look at. Instead, it seemed to reach inside me and illuminate parts of my soul that had been dark for so long I had forgotten they existed. As I drew closer to the source of this radiance, I began to understand that I was approaching something beyond my comprehension, something so magnificent that my human mind, even freed from its earthly limitations, struggled to grasp its reality. Then I emerged from the tunnel into a realm that defied every description I could ever attempt. Imagine the most beautiful place you have ever seen. The moment in nature that took your breath away and made you believe in something greater than yourself. Now multiply that beauty by infinity, and you might begin to approach what surrounded me in that eternal instant. I found myself in a space that seemed to extend forever in all directions, filled with light that was somehow alive. This was not the harsh, fluorescent light of the prison camp, or the blazing heat of the Texas sun. This light had personality, character, warmth that penetrated every part of my being. It pulsed gently like a cosmic heartbeat, and within its rhythm I could hear something that might have been music, or might have been the sound of perfect love, singing to itself. The colors in this place were unlike anything that exists on Earth. There were blues deeper than the deepest ocean, golds that put the finest sunrise to shame, greens that made earthly forests look pale and lifeless by comparison. But beyond the visible spectrum, there were colors I had no names for, hues that human eyes are not designed to see, but that filled my spiritual vision with wonder. As I stood in this realm, if standing is the right word for what a bodiless spirit does, I became aware that I was more alive than I had ever been in my physical form. Every sense was heightened beyond imagination. I could perceive layers of reality that had been hidden from me during my earthly life. I understood that the material world I had known was just the surface of existence, like seeing only the tip of an iceberg while the vast bulk of reality lay hidden beneath. But the most overwhelming aspect of this place was not its beauty or its strangeness. It was the presence of love so pure and complete that it nearly overwhelmed me. This was not the conditional love of human relationships, based on what we do, or who we are, or how well we perform. This was love in its perfect form, love without reservation, or limit, or end. It filled every corner of this realm like oxygen fills our lungs, essential and life-giving and impossible to live without. As I marveled at my surroundings, I became aware that I was being watched. The sensation was gentle but unmistakable, like feeling someone's eyes on you in a crowded room. I turned, though turning had no real meaning in that place, and saw a figure of light approaching from a distance that might have been miles or might have been inches. In that realm, space and time followed different rules than the ones I had known. As the figure drew nearer, my spiritual heart began to pound with a rhythm I recognized but had never felt so strongly. This was the rhythm of coming home after a lifetime of wandering, of finding something you did not even know you had lost. The figure was still far away, but I knew with absolute certainty who was coming toward me. I had never been a Christian, had barely heard the name Jesus Christ, except in the occasional curse words of American guards. But I knew beyond any doubt that I was about to meet the Son of God. Have you ever felt completely known? Not just understood or accepted, but known in the deepest possible sense, as if someone could see every thought you had ever had, every choice you had ever made, every moment of joy and pain and fear and hope that had shaped your existence. As Jesus approached me in that realm of perfect light, I felt exposed in a way that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with the strangest sense of relief. He was still some distance away, but his presence preceded him like waves on a shore. Each step he took, if steps they were, sent ripples of love and peace washing over me. I wanted to run toward him, and I wanted to flee from him in the same instant. Every sin I had ever committed, every cruel word I had spoken, every act of violence I had participated in during the war, all of it was visible to him. Yet he kept walking toward me with arms slightly extended, as if he was approaching a beloved friend he had not seen in far too long. I fell to my knees, though I had no physical knees to fall upon. The gesture was instinctive, the only appropriate response to finding myself in the presence of perfect holiness. In that moment, I understood that I was a creature meeting his Creator, a broken man encountering the source of all healing, a lost soul standing before the only one who could show him the way home. But what amazed me most, as Jesus continued his approach, was that there was no condemnation in his manner, no anger or disappointment in his bearing. Instead, he radiated joy, as if my arrival in this place was the answer to a prayer he had been praying since the day I was born. He was coming to welcome me, not to judge me. He was coming to embrace me, not to cast me away. As he drew near enough for me to see his face, I understood that my death in that Texas prison camp had not been an ending at all. It had been a doorway, a passage from one chapter of existence to another. And the being of light who was walking toward me with such evident love was about to show me things about myself, about my life, and about his incredible grace that would change everything I thought I knew about redemption. When Jesus finally reached me in that realm of perfect light, he did not speak with an audible voice. Instead, his words came directly into my heart, bypassing my ears entirely. The first thing he said to me was, "Hiroshi, my beloved son." Those 4 words contained more love than I had experienced in my entire earthly life, but they also filled me with confusion and shame. "But Lord," I stammered, though I had no mouth to speak with, "I am not Christian. I have done terrible things. I am not worthy to be called your son." His response came with such gentleness that it nearly brought me to tears I could not physically shed. "I know, Hiroshi. I have always known. That is exactly why I am here." Jesus extended his hand toward me, and as I took it, the realm around us began to shimmer and change. What happened next was unlike anything I could have prepared for. My entire life began to unfold around us like an enormous tapestry. every moment visible at once, every choice and consequence laid bare in the light of his presence. "We are going to look at everything together," he told me, and his voice held no threat, only the promise of truth spoken in love. The review began with my earliest memories, scenes from my childhood in Osaka that I had not thought about in decades. I saw myself as a small boy, maybe 4 years old, helping my mother tend to our tiny garden behind our cramped house. She was teaching me to be gentle with the seedlings, showing me how to water them without washing away the soil. Her voice carried across the years. "Hiroshi-chan, we must be kind to growing things. They depend on us to help them become what they are meant to be." Jesus stood beside me as we watched this scene unfold, and I could feel his smile without seeing it. "See how love motivated everything in those early years," he said. "This gentleness was part of who I created you to be." We moved through my childhood like travelers in a museum of memory. I saw my father coming home from his job at the steel mill, exhausted and covered in grime, but always finding energy to play with me before dinner. I watched myself learning to read, struggling over the complex characters of our written language while my mother patiently corrected my mistakes. I saw my first day of school, my first friendship with a boy named Taro, who lived down our street, my first experience of loss when my grandmother died, and I could not understand why she would not wake up. Every human story begins with innocence, Jesus said as we observed these early scenes. "You were created for love, Hiroshi. Everything that came after was a departure from this original design." Then the review moved into my teenage years, and I began to see the gradual changes that had shaped my path toward military service. Japan was becoming increasingly militaristic, and young men like me were taught that our highest honor lay in serving the emperor. I watched myself at 16, listening to recruitment speeches that painted war as glorious adventure and military service as the ultimate expression of patriotism. But what I saw now, through the lens of eternal perspective, was how my genuine desire to help my struggling family had been twisted into something else. The recruiter who visited our school spoke of the regular pay, the honor that would come to my parents, the chance to serve something greater than myself. My 17-year-old self had signed up not from bloodlust or hatred, but from a sincere desire to lift my family out of poverty. "See how good intentions can be corrupted," Jesus said gently. "Your heart was right, but the system you entered was designed to harden that heart." The scenes that followed were increasingly difficult to watch. I saw my military training, the systematic process by which young men were transformed into instruments of war. Our instructors taught us to dehumanize our enemies, to see Chinese and Filipino people as less than human, to believe that showing mercy was weakness and that absolute obedience to orders was the highest virtue. I watched my first kill in combat, a Chinese soldier barely older than myself who had been trying to surrender. My commanding officer had shouted at me to fire, and I had obeyed without thinking. The young man had fallen backward into a rice paddy, his blood mixing with the muddy water. I saw my 18-year-old self standing frozen in shock, unable to process what I had just done. "This was the moment you began to die inside," Jesus observed. "Not your physical death in the prison camp, but the death of the gentle boy who had learned to tend seedlings with care. What followed was the gradual hardening of my heart through months and years of combat. Each act of violence made the next one easier. Each atrocity I witnessed or participated in built another wall around the part of me that had once known how to love. I saw myself becoming someone I no longer recognized. Someone who could follow orders to burn villages without flinching, who could watch civilians die without feeling anything at all. But the most devastating part of the review came when Jesus showed me my actions from the perspective of my victims. Suddenly, I was not just observing my past, I was experiencing it through their eyes. I felt the terror of the Chinese farmers whose village we destroyed in 1944. I experienced the desperation of the Filipino families we separated during our occupation. I lived through their pain, their loss, their grief, as if it were my own. The scene that broke me completely was the one I had dreaded most. We were back in that village where I had encountered Maria Santos, the young mother who had pleaded for her children's lives. But now, I experienced the moment from her perspective. I felt her terror as our unit surrounded the village. I experienced her desperate hope when she saw something human in my eyes. I felt her heart breaking when I turned away and let the inevitable happen. The emotional weight of experiencing every moment of pain I had caused was beyond description. I was drowning in an ocean of suffering, understanding for the first time the true cost of my actions. Each person I had wronged, each life I had affected, each family I had torn apart, I experienced their pain as completely as if it had been inflicted on me. I cannot bear this, I cried out to Jesus. The weight of what I have done is too much. But he did not let me collapse under the burden. Instead, he began to show me something that defied every expectation I had about justice and judgment. One by one, the people I had wronged began to appear in that realm of light. They were there, in that place of perfect peace, and they were whole. Maria Santos was among them, but she was not the terrified mother I remembered. She radiated the same peace and joy that filled every corner of that heavenly realm. When she saw me, she smiled with a compassion that nearly undid me completely. "Hiroshi-san," she said, and her voice held no trace of accusation or anger. "I forgive you. You were lost, but now you are found." One after another they came forward. The Chinese soldier I had killed in his rice paddy, the elderly man who had died when we burned his village, children whose parents I had helped take away. All of them were there, all of them at peace, and all of them offering me the forgiveness I had never dared to hope for. What would you have done, standing before the God of the universe, seeing every cruel thing you had ever done, yet witnessing the impossible reality that your victims had found peace and were offering you grace? I wept tears that somehow existed in that spiritual realm, tears of relief and wonder and overwhelming gratitude. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt strength flowing into me like water into parched ground. "This is grace, Hiroshi," he said. "Justice would send you away from this place, but I choose mercy. I choose love. I choose you." He gestured, and suddenly I could see the cross, though it appeared not as a wooden instrument of torture, but as a bridge spanning the chasm between my sin and God's holiness. I understood in that instant that everything I had done, every act of cruelty and violence, had been absorbed by his sacrifice. The debt had been paid, not by me, but for me. "Your guilt dies here if you let it," Jesus told me. "You can carry it back with you, or you can leave it at the foot of the cross where it belongs. The choice is yours." For the first time in years, I felt the crushing weight begin to lift from my soul. The shame, that had defined my existence, the guilt that had eaten away at my humanity, was being offered a burial place. I could lay it down and walk away free, not because I deserved freedom, but because he had purchased it for me with his blood. In that moment of supreme grace, surrounded by the forgiveness of those I had wronged and the perfect love of the one who had died for my sins, I finally understood what redemption meant. It was not something I could earn through suffering or good works. It was a gift, freely given, that I could only receive with empty, grateful hands. After experiencing the overwhelming grace of seeing my victims offer forgiveness, after understanding that my guilt could be buried at the foot of the cross, I assumed my journey was complete. I thought Jesus would welcome me into that realm of perfect peace permanently, that my suffering was finally over. But as we stood together in that place of incredible light, surrounded by the presence of those I had wronged who had become my advocates for mercy, Jesus began to speak to me about something I had not anticipated. Hiroshi, he said, his voice carrying the same infinite love, but now tinged with a purpose that made my spirit tremble. You have a choice to make. I looked at him with confusion, not understanding what choice could remain. I had accepted his grace. I had received forgiveness from those I had wronged. I had laid my guilt at his feet and watched it disappear into the light of his sacrifice. What more could there be? Jesus gestured, and suddenly the realm around us shifted. Instead of the timeless space where we had been conducting the life review, I found myself looking down at scenes from Earth. But these were not scenes from my past. These were glimpses of what could be my future if I chose to return to the world I had left behind. You can stay here in perfect peace, he explained, or you can return to Earth with a purpose. The first vision he showed me nearly took my breath away. I saw myself back in Camp Huntsville, but not as the broken, guilt-ridden prisoner I had been. Instead, I was speaking to groups of my fellow Japanese prisoners, sharing the story of what I had experienced during my time in that heavenly realm. I watched as hardened men, soldiers who had committed their own terrible acts during the war, broke down in tears as they heard about grace that was bigger than their worst moments. I saw Kenji, my quiet friend from the laundry room, falling to his knees as he accepted Jesus as his Savior. I watched other prisoners. Men I knew were carrying the same crushing guilt that had nearly destroyed me, finding hope for the first time in years. The vision expanded to show me speaking in American churches, sharing my testimony with congregations who had lost sons and husbands to Japanese soldiers like me, yet finding forgiveness and healing through my story. Your greatest pain will become your greatest ministry, Jesus told me as we watched these scenes unfold. The very experiences that brought you the deepest shame will become the foundation for bringing others to salvation. But the visions did not stop there. I saw myself years in the future, working with a kind American woman who would become my wife. Together, we were ministering to other former soldiers, both American and Japanese, who were struggling with the psychological wounds of war. I watched as we established programs to help men process their guilt and find healing through the gospel. Then the vision took me to a place that made me gasp with recognition. I was standing in the Philippines, in what had once been Maria Santos's village. But instead of the burned ruins I had left behind, I saw a thriving community with a small Christian church at its center. I watched an older version of myself preaching to Filipino families, sharing the gospel in their own language, which I had somehow learned. The very place where I had committed some of my worst atrocities had been transformed into a center of hope and healing. This is what I can do with surrendered brokenness, Jesus explained. This is how I turn mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty. The final vision was perhaps the most powerful of all. I saw Maria Santos's surviving family members, children and grandchildren I had never met, listening as I asked their forgiveness face to face. But instead of rejection, they welcomed me with the same grace their mother had shown me in that heavenly realm. Together, we were building an orphanage for children whose parents had been lost to war and violence. As these visions faded, I found myself back in that timeless space with Jesus, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering me. But I was also filled with reluctance that surprised me with its intensity. Lord, I said, I do not want to leave this place. Here there is no pain, no struggle, no memory of the terrible things I have done. Here I am, finally at peace. Why would I choose to return to a world of suffering and difficulty? His response came with perfect understanding. Because, Hiroshi, there are others who are where you were. There are men in prison camps who believe they are beyond redemption. There are soldiers haunted by nightmares who think their sins are unforgivable. There are victims of war who need to hear that healing is possible. They need to hear your story. I realized then that my reluctance was not just about leaving paradise behind. It was about the difficulty of the mission he was offering me. But Lord, who will believe a war criminal's testimony? Who will listen to someone like me speak about your love? Jesus smiled, and in that smile, I saw centuries of human history, countless stories of broken people being transformed by grace and used for his purposes. That is exactly why they will believe it, Hiroshi. If I can save you, I can save anyone. If I can forgive what you have done. No sin is beyond my reach. He placed both hands on my shoulders, and I felt his power flowing through my spiritual form like electricity. But this was not destructive power. This was creative power, healing power, the same force that had spoken the universe into existence and raised the dead to life. You will tell them that no one is beyond my reach, he continued. You will be living proof that grace is bigger than guilt, that love is stronger than hate, that redemption is possible for even the worst of sinners. Ask yourself this question. What would it take for you to completely abandon paradise to serve others who were still lost in darkness? As I stood there with Jesus, feeling the weight and honor of the calling he was placing on my life, I began to understand that true love sometimes requires sacrifice. The same love that had brought me to that place of perfect peace was now asking me to leave it behind for the sake of others who needed to experience that same grace. The decision was not easy. Every part of me wanted to remain in that realm of light, surrounded by forgiveness and perfect love. I wanted to rest in the presence of those I had wronged, who had become my friends and advocates. I wanted to explore the wonders of eternity, to learn the secrets of the universe, to bask forever in the unfiltered presence of God. But as I considered Jesus' words, I began to see that this was not really about what I wanted. It was about what love demanded. The same love that had pursued me across the battlefield of my guilt-ridden heart was now calling me to pursue others who were trapped in their own prisons of shame and despair. I will return, Lord, I finally said, though the words felt like they were being torn from the depths of my soul. If you believe my story can help others find you, then I will go back. The moment I spoke those words, Jesus embraced me with a love so complete that it seemed to rearrange the very atoms of my spiritual being. In that embrace, I felt his strength becoming mine, his purpose becoming mine, his heart for lost and broken people becoming mine. This will not be easy, he warned me. You will face ridicule and disbelief. Some will reject your message. You will struggle with doubt and discouragement. But I will be with you always, and the lives that are changed through your testimony will make every difficulty worthwhile. He stepped back and gestured toward the tunnel of light through which I had originally arrived. It is time, Hiroshi. Your new life is waiting. As I began to move toward the passage that would take me back to the world of flesh and blood, I carried with me not just the memory of grace received, but the commission to share that grace with others. I was returning not as the same man who had died on that laundry room floor, but as an ambassador of the kingdom of heaven, carrying a message that would transform not just my own life, but the lives of countless others who needed to hear that redemption was possible. The journey back through the tunnel was faster than my original passage, as if I was being propelled by divine urgency. Behind me, I could still feel the presence of Jesus and the continuing love of those who had forgiven me. Ahead of me lay a world that desperately needed to hear what I had learned, that no one, no matter what they have done, is beyond the reach of God's amazing grace. The return to my physical body was the most violent experience I have ever endured. One moment, I was traveling peacefully through that tunnel of light, carrying the love and purpose Jesus had given me, and the next moment, I was crashing back into flesh and bone like a meteorite hitting the earth. Every nerve in my body screamed to life at once. My lungs, which had been still for over 7 minutes, suddenly demanded air with a desperation that felt like drowning in reverse. I gasped awake under the white sheet that Lieutenant Hayes had pulled over my face, thrashing like a man pulled from deep water. The fabric clung to my skin, damp with perspiration, and I clawed it away from my face as I struggled to breathe. My heart, which had stopped beating completely, now hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The first words that came from my mouth were not in Japanese or broken English. They were a name that I had never spoken with such conviction before that moment. Jesus. Jesus saved me. Lieutenant Hayes, who had been writing out my death certificate at a small desk in the corner of the infirmary, dropped his clipboard with a clatter that echoed off the concrete walls. His face went completely white as he stared at me, sitting up on the stretcher where my corpse had been lying moments before. "That's impossible," he whispered, his medical training warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "You were dead. I checked for a pulse myself. You were dead for over 7 minutes. But I was very much alive, more alive than I had ever been in my entire existence." The crushing guilt that had weighed on my chest for 3 years was completely gone, replaced by a joy so profound that I could not stop smiling, even as tears streamed down my face. The transformation was so complete, so instantaneous, that I felt like I was wearing someone else's skin. Word of my resurrection spread through Camp Huntsville like wildfire. Within an hour, prisoners and guards alike had gathered outside the infirmary, whispering among themselves about the Japanese prisoner who had come back from the dead. Some crossed themselves. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few muttered about tricks and deceptions. unwilling to accept what they had witnessed. Kenji was among the first to reach me, his quiet face etched with wonder and confusion. "Hiroshi-san," he said in Japanese, "what happened to you? You are not the same man who collapsed in the laundry room." He was right. The man who had died that morning had been consumed by shame and hopelessness. The man who returned carried the light of eternity in his eyes and the unshakable knowledge that he was loved beyond measure. "I met Jesus, Kenji," I told him, switching to English so the guards could understand. "He showed me things about forgiveness, about grace. He gave me a new heart, a new purpose." My friend stared at me as if I had lost my mind. "You have never been Christian, Hiroshi. You barely know who Jesus is." "I know him now," I replied, with certainty that surprised even me. "And he knows me. He knows everything I have done, and he loves me anyway." The camp chaplain, a kind Baptist minister named Williams, arrived within the hour. He was a man in his 50s who had served as a military chaplain during the war before being assigned to minister to prisoners. I had seen him around the camp, but had never spoken to him directly. Most of the Japanese prisoners kept their distance from the Christian chaplain, viewing him with the suspicion that prisoners reserve for authority figures. But when Chaplain Williams entered the infirmary and saw me sitting on the edge of the stretcher, radiating peace and joy despite having been clinically dead minutes earlier, he fell to his knees right there on the concrete floor. "Lord Jesus," he prayed aloud, "I have prayed for 3 years that you would touch the hearts of these men. I never imagined you would answer so dramatically. Over the following days, I experienced a hunger for God's word that was unlike any physical hunger I had ever known. Though my English was limited, and my knowledge of Christianity was practically non-existent, I begged Chaplain Williams to teach me everything he could about the Bible, about Jesus, about this faith that had literally brought me back from the dead. We spent hours each day in his small office, reading scripture together. Every verse seemed to speak directly to my heart. The stories of forgiveness, of redemption, of God's love for sinners felt like personal letters written specifically for me. When we read about the thief on the cross who found salvation in his final moments, I wept with recognition. When we studied Paul's testimony about being the chief of sinners, I understood that God specialized in transforming the worst of men into his greatest ambassadors. Ask yourself this question: what would it take for you to completely abandon your old life and embrace a new identity? For me, there was no gradual transition, no slow evolution from one belief system to another. The change was as instantaneous and complete as my death and resurrection had been. I was a new creation, as Paul wrote, and the old things had passed away. My fellow Japanese prisoners reacted to my transformation with a mixture of amazement, skepticism, and fear. Some, like Kenji, were genuinely curious about what had happened to me. They could see that the change in my demeanor was real and profound. The nightmares that had plagued me for years had completely stopped. The depression and hopelessness that had characterized my daily existence had been replaced by an inexplicable joy. But others thought I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown from the trauma of my near-death experience. They whispered among themselves that the lack of oxygen to my brain had damaged my thinking, that I was living in a delusion brought on by medical trauma. "Hiroshi-san," one of the older prisoners said to me during our evening meal, "you are embarrassing yourself with this Christian talk. We are Japanese. This is not our way." I understood their concern, but I could not deny what I had experienced. "I am still Japanese," I replied gently. "But now I am also a child of God. Jesus did not change my race or my culture. He changed my heart. Within 2 weeks of my resurrection, Kenji became the first of my fellow prisoners to accept Christ as his Savior. The change in me had been so dramatic, so obviously real, that he could not dismiss it as delusion or trauma. One evening, as we sat together in the barracks, he asked me to pray for him. "I have done terrible things too, Hiroshi," he confessed. "If there is really forgiveness for men like us, I want to know this Jesus you have met." That night, in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, surrounded by men who had been our nation's enemies, Kenji gave his life to Christ. The joy on his face when he prayed that simple prayer of surrender was a reflection of the joy I had experienced in that heavenly realm. I realized then that this was why Jesus had sent me back. Every person who found salvation through my testimony made the difficulty of leaving paradise worthwhile. Over the following months, several other prisoners began attending the chapel services that Chaplain Williams held each Sunday. Some came out of curiosity about my story. Others came because they could see the peace that Kenji and I had found and wanted to experience it for themselves. A few came because they were desperate enough to try anything that might relieve the crushing weight of their wartime guilt. Not all of them accepted the gospel. Some listened politely, but returned to their barracks unchanged. Others became angry when they heard about grace and forgiveness, insisting that men like us deserved only punishment for what we had done. But enough were transformed that even the guards began to notice the change in the atmosphere of the camp. When news came in 1949 that the camp would be closing and we would have a choice between repatriation to Japan or remaining in America, I knew immediately what my decision would be. Japan represented my old life, my old identity as a man consumed by shame and guilt. America, despite being the land of my former enemies, had become the place where I'd found redemption. Chaplain Williams offered me the opportunity to work with him in a ministry to other former prisoners of war. "Hiroshi," he said, "your story needs to be told. There are thousands of men, both American and Japanese, who are struggling with what they did during the war. They need to hear that healing is possible." I accepted his offer without hesitation. This was the mission Jesus had shown me in those visions during my time in eternity. This was why he had sent me back. My greatest shame was about to become my greatest ministry, exactly as he had promised. Look inside your own heart right now. What guilt are you carrying that you think disqualifies you from God's love? What shame keeps you awake at night, convincing you that you are beyond redemption? I am here to tell you, as a man who has seen both sides of eternity, that there is no sin too great for Jesus' love to overcome. I should have died, a condemned war criminal in that Texas prison camp. Instead, I was given a new life, a new purpose, and a message that would transform thousands of other broken lives over the decades to come. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka. I died so I could truly live. This is my testimony. This is his love. This is your invitation to experience the same grace that changed everything for me.